Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to the webinar. My name is Liz Kendall, and I'm a Senior Program Associate at Winrock International, and I work on the Sustainable Water Partnership. I'm going to be helping on the logistics and in the background today. So just before we get started, I just wanted to walk you through the platform. So if you have any technical issues, please put it in the chat. It's the box at the bottom. And then right above that, you'll see a box for questions, and that's where you should put any questions in real time that you have as we go through the presentations and the panel. And then those will be addressed at the end of the webinar. So take it away.
Thank you, Liz. Dear participants and colleagues, I have the pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on behalf of the Sustainable Water Partnership. Basil, if you want to put the next slide. My name is Nicholas Vilminot. I'm the Technical Director for the Water portfolio at Winrock International. And we are here work on this webinar for the Sustainable Water Partnership, which is a 5-year project funded by USAID, implemented by Winrock International in partnership with Tetra Tech, the Stockholm Environmental Institute, IUCN, M-Water, the World Resources Institute, and the CEO Water Mandate. Since 2016, the project has been supporting USAID to integrate water security issues into programming, developing and piloting tools, and reflecting on technical learning and approaches to engage stakeholders and promote their participation. As the project is approaching its term, I hope that you will be able to join us for one more webinar early September. This will be our closeout event, where we will reflect on the learning and achievement of the project and the next steps at stake for USAID to ensure cooperation and improve water security around the globe. But today's webinar, we will focus on water resources, a critical piece of the water security puzzle that is increasingly requiring our attention and effort. Challenges to understand, measure, and manage surface water and groundwater are faced by many water-stressed regions in the world, but consideration need to go well beyond water scarcity. Not enough or too much water is only one part of the equation, as we will see. Over-abstraction of water is impacting economic activities, harming biodiversity, and leaving communities without access to reliable and adequate water supplies to meet their basic needs. Meanwhile, the quality of the water is under threat, with agricultural runoff, industrial effluents, municipal waste that introduce pathogenic and chemical contaminants with environmental and public health risks. At the same time, climate change and rising temperatures are changing seasonality and precipitation patterns, causing more frequent and intense droughts and floods, a rise in sea levels, causing more saline water intrusions, erosion, directly affecting recharge of aquifers, storage, and glaciers. So water resources need to be better managed and understood, and especially at a time where they may be changing. Economic development opportunities, the sustainability of aid investments, the prevention of conflicts around resources, and as we've been severely reminded this past year, public health crisis will all require a concerted effort to ensure protection and management of our water resources as a common good shared between countries and nations, between our communities and the environment we live in. The Sustainable Water Partnership worked with the Center for Water Security, Sanitation and Hygiene in Washington and USAID missions to develop individual country profiles on water resources for each of the 18 Water for the World Act high priority countries. And we are excited to formally launch the first batch of these profiles today, and we'll publish the remaining profiles on a rolling basis over the next few weeks. To mark the occasion, we wanted to engage distinguished experts, practitioners, and attendees in a discussion on water resources challenges highlighted in those profiles, as well as tools and opportunities to address the challenges. To start, Dr. Basil Mahaney will give a presentation to frame our conversation around water resources and introduce the water resources country profiles on behalf of the Sustainable Water Partnership. Dr. Mahaney will then host a panel discussion between 3 experts with different perspectives on water resources. Dr. Annette Hubberly, Senior Scientist for the Stockholm Environmental Institute, Ms. Gina Gami, Deputy Director for the Forest Trend Association, working on USAID's Natural Infrastructure for Water Security in Peru, and Dr. Alison McLady, Senior Water Security Advisor at USAID's Center for Water Security, Sanitation and Hygiene in Washington. I hope you find the discussion engaging, and I encourage you to participate with the questions in the chat, post comments that will be addressed as much as we can during the Q&A section after the panel discussion. Welcome to our webinar, Water Resources in Peril, a discussion of challenges and opportunities. Coming up, Dr. Mahaney is the Deputy Director of the Sustainable Water Partnership through Tetra Tech. Dr. Mahaney holds a PhD in Geography, Environment, and Society from the University of Minnesota. He's a water governance and water security specialist with over 10 years of experience working in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South America. He was the Technical Activity Manager for our pilot activity in the Mara River Basin in East Africa, and has overseen thought leadership for the Sustainable Water Partnership, including the development of these country profiles for water resources. Dr. Mahaney, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicolas. Welcome, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you might be. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge our researchers and writers, reviewers, and of course, USAID for all of the hard work that has gone into the profiles over the last year. These profiles cover the 18 USAID Water for the World Act high priority countries. And for those of you who might not be familiar with them, most of them are in Sub-Saharan Africa. There are 4 in Asia and Haiti in the Caribbean. The goal of the profiles is to provide a technical overview of key water management challenges, and the topics covered in each profile include surface and groundwater availability and quality, water resources and climate, and governance and policy, focusing specifically on risks and stress factors. And during this presentation, I'll discuss a few of the common challenges and risk factors that are highlighted in the profiles and provide some examples from them. The target audience for these profiles are USAID missions, implementers, technical specialists, researchers, and people who might be new to water resources or interested in the subject matter. And you can find the profiles on swpwater.org. We just launched a country profiles page where you can find the first 6 profiles. All of the resources will also be migrated over to Global Waters, and we will be publishing the remaining profiles on a rolling basis over the next few weeks. And before I begin, I would like to share an example of one of the profiles to illustrate what you can expect to find. So this is our final profile for Afghanistan, and all of these, they're the same template, so you can expect all of them to look the same. We begin on the first page with key takeaways for the key topics covered. So this is basically an executive summary of some of the challenges and risk factors within the country. The next section is water resources availability. For each of the sections, we highlight some of the key takeaways, and here we describe the key surface water basins, and then base information on groundwater resources. We also provide a summary table on key water resources data, and for each country we offer a comparison to its region. So for Afghanistan, it's Central and South Asia, and some of the information you will find is precipitation, a breakdown of renewable freshwater resources, and a breakdown by surface and groundwater, stress indices, which I will discuss here in a few minutes, and then other relevant data, including dependency ratio, which is the percentage of water resources that originate outside the country, interannual variability, which is basically the variability of water supply from year to year, and also seasonal variability, which is the availability of water from season to season, and then environmental flow requirements, which is the quantity, timing, and quality of water flows to sustain freshwater ecosystems and to meet human and ecological demand. There's a map of these of each country. In these maps, we highlight key surface water bodies, critical dams that are discussed in the profiles. Where relevant, we flag Ramsar sites, protected wetlands, and then key or major cities, and we overlay precipitation to give you a sense of wetness and aridity within the country. The following 2 sections are surface water outlook and groundwater outlook, and in these sections we talk about the the issues of demand and additional stress factors and their impacts on water availability and water quality. And so we've got, a top line sort of key statement with a discussion of some of the evidence that we found in the desk review. The fourth section is on water resources and climate, and we talk about current climate and weather trends. So what is the trend with regards to temperatures, for example, and then what is projected over the course of the next 50 to 100 years and the implications for water availability going forward. And then we used data from WRI's aqueduct tool to project drought risk and riverine flood risk. And as you can see in Afghanistan, drought risk and riverine flood risk is quite high throughout the country. And then the last section is a presentation on water governance and policy. And we offer a summary table on key laws and policies and plans. And these are basically what sort of sets the direction of the goals and objectives of the water sector in that country. What are the roles and responsibilities assigned to different management entities and institutions? And then a second table on what are the critical water management entities within that country. In some cases, there are transboundary ones, and so we flagged those as well, but mostly it's national and subnational, and these can range from ministries all the way down to water user associations. And also we offer, a discussion of the specific governance risks. Okay. So the focus of these profiles is water stress, which considers water availability, water quality, and environmental flows. But we use two key indices to provide a high-level overview of water stress. And it's important to note that there are many different types of indices that are available, but we opted to use these given their prominence in the broader field and in debates and also in connection to the SDGs. The Falcon Mark Water Stress Index uses total renewable water resources per capita per year to characterize a country or a location as being water stressed, water scarce, or severely water scarce. And you can see the breakdown of these categories on the slide. And these stress and scarcity categories are based on specific definitions of demand to meet various needs. And overall, only 7 out of the 18 countries are characterized as water stress, in which total renewable water resources were less than 1,700 cubic meters per person. The second index is SDG 6.4.2, water stress, which measures the percentage of freshwater withdrawals for economic and productive uses against total renewable water resources. And only 4 out of the 18 countries were experiencing stress at a national scale as abstractions exceeded 25%. Now, both indices provide an overarching national scale lens into water stress, and they're useful for preliminary benchmarking and comparisons across countries. However, resource availability weighs heavily in these indices, and water stress is more than just the availability of water. Water stress can appear even when there's an abundance of water. And in most cases, challenges or stress factors are most evident at subnational or basin scales. And next, I'm going to discuss some of the common challenges or risks that are discussed in the profiles, beginning with surface water. Now, surface water is critical for agriculture, for industry, and for municipal water supply. Surface water bodies also play important functions within local ecosystems. However, there are a few factors that are contributing to water availability and water quality risks. First, growing demand for irrigated agriculture and other uses have increased risks of over-abstraction and led to increased erosion and sedimentation, affecting critical environmental flows and reducing water quality. It's also affecting downstream communities as surface water becomes less available or less reliable. And this is happening both within a country and in transboundary contexts. Second, poor sanitation systems, municipal waste, and industrial effluent are reducing surface water quality and degrading aquatic ecosystems, particularly around urban areas. These have led to algal blooms, increased pathogenic contamination, and chemical toxins in key surface water bodies. For example, agricultural runoff has led to eutrophication in the Senegal River Valley, and approximately 30% of Lake Gears, which is a key source of municipal water, is affected by eutrophication and plant growth. Similarly, untreated industrial effluent, wastewater, and agricultural runoff have contributed to eutrophication and algal blooms and caused mass fish die-offs in Lake Victoria in East Africa. These contaminants are also risks to public health through bioaccumulation of key toxins in fish, which is a key source of protein for many communities, as well as water used for drinking and domestic supply. Third, large and small-scale mining have discharged toxic chemicals and metals into surface water, increased sedimentation and erosion, particularly along riverbanks. In Ghana, small-scale Galamsey mining for gold is severely degraded land and water, and it is estimated that restoring land and water degraded by this small-scale mining could cost up to $250 million. There are many ongoing efforts to increase data and understanding of groundwater, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but within these countries, there are significant data gaps which can affect planning and management. These help contribute to several concerns related to groundwater over-abstraction and groundwater quality. First, highly concentrated withdrawals in urban areas have significantly lowered water tables, which can increase the cost of abstraction and make groundwater a less reliable resource. In Jakarta, over-abstraction has led to subsidence in which the city is actually sinking, impacting infrastructure and increasing flood risks. Second, many communities around the world depend on springs as key resources for drinking and domestic use and their livelihoods, but declining water tables are lowering outflows from springs and potentially drying up springs altogether. In Nepal, for example, freshwater springs supplement dry season river flows in some regions, but land use practices and climate change have affected groundwater recharge and spring replenishment, and in combination with increased demand have led some springs to dry up. Third, naturally occurring contaminants, including fluoride and arsenic, pose public health risks, particularly for rural communities who rely on groundwater for drinking supply. This is especially true in the Great Rift Valley in East Africa, where incidents of fluorosis are high. Fourth, poor sanitation systems and leaching municipal and industrial waste are contaminating groundwater with key toxins. And last, over-abstraction and rising sea levels is leading to saltwater intrusion into coastal aquifers, which may irreversibly degrade key sources of drinking water supply for major coastal cities. Climate change is one of the most important risk factors as it affects water resources in several ways. First, climate change is changing wet season and dry season patterns. This is making precipitation less predictable, which affects millions of people who depend on rain-fed agriculture. In some cases, total precipitation may be increasing, but is received within shorter periods of time, which can result in extreme flooding, damage infrastructure, and of course, affect livelihoods. And this is an emerging trend in the Mara Basin in Kenya and Tanzania, where the Mara River is a key watercourse for local communities and their livelihoods, as well as the wildlife and nature reserves. Second, temperatures are rising and drought is increasing. In Afghanistan, rising temperatures are accelerating glacier and snowpack melt, which serve as natural storage and help protect against drought and replenish surface water. And so as these glaciers disappear over time, there's concern about what happens during dry seasons and in periods of drought in terms of surface water availability for those communities. Similarly, in northern Nigeria and in northern Ghana, hotter temperatures, longer dry seasons, and more frequent drought have increased evaporation and reduced surface water availability. Third, storms are also becoming more intense and increasing risks of extreme flooding and widespread damage. And this is particularly concerning in countries like Madagascar, Mozambique, and Haiti, and other coastal areas which have already experienced several significant natural disasters in recent years. Last, we reviewed governance and policy frameworks for water resources management. One of the main challenges is that water management responsibilities are often fragmented or distributed across different ministries or entities, which can make coordination and collaboration difficult. These challenges are compounded by low funding, technical capacity constraints, and understaffing. And as a result, integrated water resources management planning and implementation can be slow. It can also lead to poor management or lack of enforcement of water abstraction and water quality permits, which can increase water availability and water quality risks, as well as reduce potential revenues that these management entities rely upon. Transboundary governance is also a challenge as institutions or entities struggle with resourcing and in some cases political will. Lack of adequate coordination and planning can lead to reduced flows and poor water quality in downstream communities, and in some cases, extreme flooding after dam releases. And this is something that's highlighted in Ghana. And overall, it's clear that there are many challenges and that these challenges are cross-cutting. And addressing them is important for ensuring community well-being and public health, protection and sustainability of ecosystem services, sustainable economic development, and resilience to climate change. My presentation provided an illustrative list of some of the key challenges and risks, and I encourage you to take a closer look at the profiles for a more robust analysis of these risk factors. Our panel discussion now will reflect on some of these challenges and discuss some of the specific opportunities and tools to address them. And with that, I would like to welcome Jenna Gami, Dr. Annette Huber-Lee, and Dr. Ali Makaladi. And I'm going to offer just a quick second round of introductions to them. Jenna is the Deputy Chief of Party of the Natural Infrastructure for Water Security Project, which aims to scale up investments in nature-based solutions for water in Peru. The project is funded by USAID and the Government of Canada and is implemented by Forest Trends in a consortium of local and international institutions in close coordination with a range of public and private partners. Jenna holds a master's in environmental policy and regulation from the London School of Economics and has worked on financing nature-based solutions for climate resilience over 10 years. Dr. Annette Huber-Lee is a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute. She has more than 25 years of professional experience in integrated water planning and management. Dr. Huber-Lee focuses on natural resource conflict management, the economics of water, and the water energy food nexus. And she has a PhD in engineering sciences from Harvard University. Dr. Ali Makaladi is a senior water security advisor at USAID Washington Center for Water Security, Sanitation, and Hygiene, where she serves as the USAID activity manager for the Sustainable Water Partnership and provides technical support to USAID mission water and sanitation programming in a number of countries across Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to joining USAID, she was a program officer with the National Academy of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering, NASEM, where she worked with the Board on Atmospheric Sciences and Climate to produce numerous reports, including next generation Earth system prediction, strategies for subseasonal and seasonal climate forecasts, and integrating social and behavioral sciences within the weather enterprise. She holds a PhD in geography and global change from the University of Arizona. Jenna, Ali, okay, welcome. Thank you for participating in this panel discussion. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. And as I noted, there are lots of really complex problems and challenges highlighted in these profiles and in these countries, and they cut across so many sectors. And so I think what would be really interesting in this discussion is to really focus on some of the tools and the opportunities and approaches to be able to address some of these. And I'll begin with a question for Annette. Planning horizons for water management are often on shorter timeframes, around 5 years, and time horizons for climate change impacts are often around sort of 50 to 100 years. So they don't align. And given the urgency and increasingly evident impacts of climate change, how can we address immediate water management and resources challenges while also paying attention to the future?
Yeah, thank you, Basil, and thank you very much for this opportunity to be a part of this panel. It's not often in my career, to be honest, to share the panel with 3 other women, so I'm especially honored for that privilege. And thank you for this important question. I mean, water planners have always had to sort of plan for the near term and the long term. That's historically been the case. I think what's extraordinarily clear right now is that we can no longer assume that what's happened in the past is going to happen in the future. The hydrology is no longer replicating what we've known in the past. And in fact, I heard a really interesting statement yesterday. We keep hearing every year now, this is the hottest June that's ever been on record. This is the hottest July that's ever been on record. And we need to completely reframe that. This is the coolest June or July that we're likely to see for the coming 100 years. That's how we have to start framing the way we approach planning around, water and natural resources more broadly. And I think the other critical piece that we need to layer onto this that's been incredibly clear as well is the pandemic. I mean, things that we would have never imagined to have happened in this past year in terms of the disruption of supply chains and its impact on food availability, basic incomes. And I think what I'm experiencing in my own work is countries are rethinking how they're approaching food security and food independence, which have large-scale impacts. So the question here is, we want to look at tools and what can we do in the face of this uncertainty. And there's a field of science that really looks at how to handle deep uncertainty. And it largely depends on finding robust strategies in the face of a wide range of possible futures. In my own work, there are 3 things that I could point to in terms of practical tools. One is some work that I've done in Southern Africa with Lesotho Highlands Development Project, which transfers water from Lesotho to South Africa, who's heavily dependent on that water. And we used something called robust decision making. And we're able to do, through that process, looking at more than 120 climate projections, identify that there could be some of that water that stays in Lesotho for basic water supply, which dramatically improves the quality of life for people in Lesotho while not significantly impacting the transfers of water to South Africa. A second quick example would be using something called robust decision support, which, as you know, Basil, and we had applied in the MARA, looking at upstream, downstream impacts, again, across impacts of climate change. And what we could find there is if the upstream country were to meet its e-flow requirements, there actually is capacity for irrigation expansion in the downstream country. And the last sort of practical example I wanted to give is some work we're doing right now in Rwanda, where we're combining some of these robust techniques with macroeconomic modeling. And we have 2 reasons for doing this. One is to demonstrate the role of water in the larger economy. So in some sense, to appreciate the value of water in a broader economic context, but also to reveal the vulnerability of the economy when water becomes more unreliable, and how to plan around that. So thank you, Basil.
Thank you, Annette. Ali, Jenna, do you have any additional thoughts you would like to add on to Annette's comments?
Yeah, sure, Basil. I'll just add a few thoughts to echo some of Annette's statements about really needing to find new tools and frameworks for addressing this deep uncertainty that comes with climate change, but also with other changes, demographic change, things like pandemics. So identifying solutions to water resource management challenges that are robust to those uncertainties, or that can be tested by a kind of a range of scenarios of future conditions. And USAID is supporting SEI in a number of places to use robust decision support in different contexts to do that. But I guess I just thought I'd talk about some other tools that USAID is gaining experience with. And for folks on the line who are part of the core audience for these profiles, USAID mission staff or other practitioners, I think that they offer some interesting case studies in addition to the ones that SWP has been involved in with the Stockholm Environment Institute. And so some of those are shared vision planning and climate risk informed decision making. So those are two frameworks that kind of add traditional water management with a kind of stakeholder driven shared visioning process. And then on top of that, kind of test different, addressing different risks with climate change information, for example, with climate risk informed decision making. And in Southern Africa, we're supporting climate informed risk decision making training and application through our Resilient Waters program, which aims to strengthen the resilience of water resources management in transboundary settings, mostly in Southern Africa. So there, some of that training has led to CRIDA being applied at Kruger National Park, where there are a lot of issues with ensuring that there's enough water available for wildlife in addition to other uses in the basin. So that's a promising place where that methodology is being applied. Also in the Dominican Republic, we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers to build in climate resilient and also stakeholder-driven water resources management in a key basin there. And I guess one thing I'd like to highlight about these sort of participatory approaches that also can be more robust to future uncertainty is the ability for them to incorporate the perspectives of folks that are often left out of water resources management decisions. So women and underrepresented groups. And so I think that combination of a more participatory approach to water resources management that takes into consideration different views of stakeholders who are normally not part of the traditional water resources management planning, which tends to be sort of top down, and then adding that layer of robust decision making onto that by testing different multiple solution sets to water resources challenges with climate change information is definitely a promising approach and one that we're starting to apply and hope to continue to work on.
Thanks, Ali. I'm curious, Jenna, how these conversations are playing out in your work in Peru. Is this sort of a focal point in your discussions as you work to improve or strengthen water security?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate the comments of both Annette and Allison. I got chills when Annette, you said this is, the coolest dune on, that's going to come. And it's so true. I mean, we've been thinking about that a lot because, I work on natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions. So I'm looking at how can conserving or restoring forests or wetlands or grasslands or restoring or maintaining traditional practices for soil and land management contribute to ensuring that we have the water quality and the water quantity that we need. We can manage risks like drought and flood. And obviously being able to model the impacts of these types of interventions is critical for planning, but we find a lot of problems when we try to do that for natural infrastructure, partly because where we're trying to model in the Andes in Peru is geographically very different from a lot of places where the models that exist to model natural infrastructure are. There's not very much historical data. And the historical data that does exist is not necessarily going to be that helpful to be able to predict what's going to come, as Annette was saying. So, the models are limited by what has happened in the past. They have to be calibrated to what you have measured, what has happened in the past. But those behaviors are, not necessarily going to continue in the future. And so we have to be able to use these tools, but use them in a way where we're acutely aware of their limits, and not just try to optimize or find kind of the most cost-effective solution, but to find a package of solutions that are going to address the risks that we have identified, and increase the resilience of the system. And so I think this is really a paradigm shift in how to think about all sorts of planning, especially water resources management, but it's really kind of a challenge for the institutions of today to be able to live in this uncertainty and complexity and embrace it rather than trying to kind of armor off and stick away from it. So yeah, it's something that we've been thinking about a lot, and I would echo that trying to incorporate more of the participatory approaches and robust decision making is absolutely necessary, as well as thinking about equity. We did an analysis of gender gaps in the water sector, and we found, I think, out of 16 out of the 20 key decision making points from the local to national levels, less than 25% representation of women in these areas. And I think there were over 60% where there's basically no representation of women. Wow. And so what this does is it limits our ability to find solutions that will actually work. We found that when we interview local women, for example, at the community level, at the landscape level, when we interview local people, men and women, we found women are much more likely to identify opportunities for addressing water risks with landscape management, working with ecosystems, whereas the men are more likely to look towards irrigation systems and built infrastructure, which is also very valid. But if we're only kind of inviting half of the population into the decision-making spaces to propose solutions, we're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities. And so I think this is also a really critical area, not only for equity, but also for, our ability to solve today's problems.
Thank you, Jenna. That's a really interesting point. And I ask a follow-up question to you and to Annette in your work that you do. I mean, in involving stakeholders, I imagine you probably see sort of very diverging opinions or preferences. Sometimes these might be very strong about what the solutions are, and maybe, you know, how have you worked with stakeholders to maybe reconcile some of those visions, and maybe what are some of the challenges you've encountered in bringing the stakeholders together to think about sort of those diverging perspectives?
I could start and then hand to Jen. And I'm really glad, Ali, that you brought up this issue of participation, because it's critical, really. I mean, we're not going to find robust solutions, as you said, Jen, if we're excluding half of the population. But I think also we need to have participation from the private sector, from both genders, or all genders, maybe it's more accurate to say. And so we've been working very hard. I should have prefaced what I said about the robust decision process is stakeholder driven, and it's challenging sometimes. I can say some of the work we did in Cambodia under SWP, we were working at a very local scale. And I remember our first conversation here was with farmers and fishers who didn't really understand what we meant by a timeline. And to sort of take a step back and say, we need to find an entirely different way to communicate here if we're going to be able to get the kind of input that we need to understand the trade-offs between, having one irrigation, once a year irrigation versus twice a year irrigation versus 3 times a year irrigation, and who has access to that water. So I think we need participation. We need to approach it very carefully, understand the audience, and how to make sure that people feel included and respected in the process.
Yeah, Jenna? I don't know if you have anything to add. Okay, well, I think this is a really great segue to a follow-up question on nature-based solutions. The nature-based solutions are increasingly cited as a key to sustainable management of water and improved ecosystems. And how can nature-based solutions help manage some of the water resources risks? And what makes nature-based solutions viable, and what are some of the barriers or impediments to these solutions? So I'll open it up to the panel. I don't know if there's anybody who would like to go first. Perhaps Jenna, given the work that you've been doing in Peru.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. So thank you for that question. And I'd like to, just give an overview to how nature-based solutions fit in the water space. We've heard a lot about nature-based solutions in terms of climate mitigation, carbon sequestration, and the kind of global dialogue. But sometimes in that narrative, we miss out on how exactly nature-based solutions can help us to also address water risks and therefore climate adaptation as well. And so what's important to recognize, Basil, I meant to also congratulate you on launching the team on launching the profiles, and it seems I'm looking forward to digging into them. They seem like really great references for folks working in the space. As you mentioned, thinking about these indicators of water stress, we don't always capture the most important dimensions in these kind of really large scale indicators. And when you think about water stress, one of the things that we focus on a lot is interannual stress, or stress that happens if you look at a hydrograph and you can imagine kind of a year with the rainy season, and you can imagine the water, goes like this kind of throughout the year. And so if you look at the average across the year of how much water you have and how much demand there is for water, in most places you probably have more water than you need. But the issue is not, is that average or is that total okay? The issue is, in the driest months of the year, do you have enough water, or in these really wet months, do you have too much water? And so what we think about a lot with nature-based solutions, for example, is how vegetative cover, how forests, how wetlands, how grasslands, how different types of land management, including agricultural field management, can help us to ensure that part of that water that falls during the rainy season can be, instead of running right off, and in the process of running off, maybe carrying some contaminants or some soils with it into the rivers, and then perhaps flowing out before it's able to be utilized and in excess of what an environmental flow requirement would be. We can infiltrate more of that water, recharging aquifers, recharging kind of the shallow surface water, and then that water can kind of slowly make its way to the stream over a period of days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, depending on the system. And so you can imagine that this natural infrastructure, this ability to manage water using our soils and vegetative cover, as well as these kind of that have learned how to do this over time in different contexts, can replace or augment infrastructures like reservoirs or lost natural infrastructures like glaciers, which historically have played this kind of role of regulating the water cycle, but we were losing in places like Peru or Afghanistan, like you mentioned. And so what we think about in natural infrastructure also is that it's really variable. So it's really important wherever you are to be really clear first about what is the water risk that you're going to be trying to manage. And then from there, in a very place-based, ideally at a watershed scale, look to usually upstream, where are the potential areas where natural infrastructure could help you to manage that particular water risk? Is it sedimentation of a dam? Is it risk of flooding? Is it kind of water scarcity in July, August for this intake? And so I need to make sure the water is above the height of the intake. Be really specific about what you're trying to manage, and then look upstream and consulting with the literature, with local hydrologists, ecologists, try to identify where there could be forest, wetlands, or other natural infrastructure that could be managed in a way to enhance the services, to protect what might already be provided by that natural infrastructure, or to restore what might have been lost. And so it's really important to not kind of look for a one-size-fits-all solution, because what different types of interventions can do varies. It really needs to be specifically designed to address specific water risks. But there's more and more knowledge and tools out there that can help to guide that decision-making process. And then once that part is scoped, it's really about thinking about the institutional arrangements and the financing and the mechanisms that are going to support the financing to kind of connect usually water users, larger populations, maybe export agriculture or something, hydropower in the lower part of the basin usually, with usually rural kind of upstream communities that have the capacity to protect natural infrastructure, implement these practices of nature-based solutions. And those usually require new ways of connecting these populations that may not know each other. In smaller watersheds, it's usually easier to get started because there are more social ties and kind of cultural connections. Folks can more easily connect to how they depend on those areas. And so if you're you want to start a big program, I would start maybe finding some of those smaller watersheds where it's easier to get some momentum started. And then look for the ways you might be able to incorporate some financing into measures like tariff structure, or public investment, or a private partnership, even a small pilot, to get started, and then you can grow through different types of financing mechanisms.
Thanks, Jenna. Annette, Ali, would you like to add anything on those remarks?
Sure, oh, go ahead, Annette.
I just really wanted to reinforce the importance of green infrastructure, and I honestly believe will become much more important as we go forward. And here, when we think of climate change, what we know is we're getting warmer. What we know much less about is it getting drier or wetter? But even within that context, what we do know is there will be increased intensity and duration of extreme events. And here I'm thinking in particular about the amount of rainfall that can fall, sorry, even in an hour. And to not have protected slopes in those conditions is a sort of a double damaging event, because it's taking away topsoil that goes downstream with detrimental impacts. And then as you were saying, Gina, it's water that's not there then stored in that upstream area. So I think we need to start paying much more attention to this. And I think the harder part of this is, as you were saying, sort of the institutional and financing of it. How do we, again, keeping equity in mind, ensure the livelihoods of these upstream people that are often quite poor, and protecting their interests while protecting what's often populations that are much better off. So I think that's really, I think this is something we need to embed in almost everything we do as water planners from this point going forward.
Ali, before I pass it to you, actually, we had received a question that I think is very relevant on this specific subject on financing, and it was actually directed to Annette, but I think it's also relevant for Jenna and your work in Peru. And the specific question was, how enhanced financial incentives for improved watershed management and nature-based solutions implementation in Lesotho might be derived from formally involving Groundwater and other South African actors in the solution. And so, I mean, Jenna, in your points, you're talking about it's important to start small and be very precise about the risks that you are wanting to address. And I think part of that obviously is really getting at that stakeholder participation, making sure that the communities are having their voices heard, because oftentimes it's the poorer communities or the most vulnerable who are most impacted by these risks. But what is the role of some of these bigger institutions or service providers? So I know in Peru you've been engaging them, but I am curious, Annette, as well, in your work, how have you engaged some of these the more formal institutions in these conversations? What role can they play in the process?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think from the experience so far in Peru, we're starting to see a really interesting evolution on the part of these bigger institutions. So at the beginning of the process, the drinking water sector, especially large utilities, have nothing to do and want nothing to do with watershed management. That is the role of the environment ministry. That is the role of the regional governments. We don't do that. We work from the intake down, right? And we have lots of problems there, and please let us focus on that. And that narrative here started to shift about 10 years ago, really led by two things: bottom-up initiatives in some of these kind of places like I was mentioning, where it's very small watershed, very clear to see the connections, deforestation happening upstream, that's impacting us. Let's get together and fix it in a pretty small city. So that starts to move the sector forward. And then at the same time, there were some really visionary leaders at the national scale who started to see that, and picked up on it and welcomed it, and started to work on how can I encourage that now, and then work on the policy to make that something that can happen more broadly. And so those kind of movements started to happen. But for example, in Peru, there are about 50 water utilities. One of them is as big as all of the others combined, and that's one that serves the capital city of Lima. And here, there's a huge water crisis. Lima is a big city of 10 million people in a desert. The projections for future impacts of climate change are really dire. They've gone through, they pump water over from the Amazon over to the coast. It's a very intensive way of supplying the city with the water it needs. It's now turning to desal. And so we're at this point where it's sort of all hands on deck. All of the potential options need to be on the table to quench the thirst of the city, but they really hadn't been looking at the opportunities in the watershed. And so we did a really basic, pretty simple look at what could you potentially get from green infrastructure investments in the upper watershed. about, this was maybe 5 years ago or so now. And what we found is that you could replace basically the amount of water that you would get from a desal plant, that amount of water you could get from investments in nature-based solutions in the upper watershed, and you increase the resilience because you're working through all of the watersheds and you're not just focused on one particular technology. That, by the way, is very intensive in energy and has its own climate impacts in that way. And so we started to look at that, and that kind of very, rudimentary but clear cost effectiveness analysis was able to start a conversation that brought in the water utility for them to say, oh, this does matter to me. I am dependent on these areas, and the investing there is something that would be relevant for me. It's another option that I can compare. But then again, that is in this context of kind of optimizing with the cost benefit, cost effectiveness frame, instead of really looking towards resilience. But we started there, and now where we're at with this utility, still lots of challenges in actually operationalizing this. But the leadership and the managers in this utility now understand their dependence. They understand how natural infrastructure can help them, and they are very interested in how these investments can also improve the livelihoods of the communities that live upstream and improve their relationships with these communities upstream, because these communities also live around a lot of the critical gray infrastructure for the utility. And so now they're seeing how this kind of opportunity to improve the social capital in the water governance system is critical also to their ability to manage current and future risks to the water supply, both through the green avenues and through the management of their gray infrastructure. And so we see this evolution, and we'll have to see where it goes. But I think that we can have faith that these institutions do have the capacity to change. We have to start by meeting them where they are and giving them some evidence to show them why this should matter to them, and then bring them along and try to find ways for them to go to the field, to meet with people, to really understand the context in which they're working, learn from other peers and water utilities in other places. That's also been helpful here. And we can see an evolution of how these institutions can change. Oh, and by the way, there's a tariff in Peru, so that part of what the water users pay to the utilities is channeled to invest in ecosystem services, nature-based solutions.
Great, thank you. Annette, I'm curious how this has sort of manifested in your work in Lesotho.
Yeah, I mean, Lesotho is a really interesting case because there already are some payments going from South Africa to Lesotho for the water itself. But I think there is increasing awareness of the need for green infrastructure improvements in Lesotho. I think this awareness has become more acute, I'd say, over the past 5 years, just a combination of drought and the intensity of rainfall when it does actually come. But I think I'd be curious, Gina, I mean, in this case, because it's transboundary, it's important to find a sort of a third party where there's some verification of what's happening in Lesotho and how it translates into impacts in South Africa. So I think it'd be really important in this particular case to find that trusted third party who could ensure the opportunities there. It's a win-win. There's no question about that. I think it's a matter of finding that third party where there's some trust between the two countries that this is indeed a win-win.
Thanks, Annette. And actually, this is a really good segue to my last question, and then we'll see if there's anything else from participants and audience members. But it's around governance. I mean, we noted that governance is a challenge in these countries at a national level, at a subnational or basin scale. Transboundary governance is also really complicated, and it can be really politically fraught for a variety of reasons. So given perpetual funding and human resource constraints and their impacts on implementation of plans and enforcement of abstraction and water quality permits, what are some of the potential entry points to address these governance challenges in sustainable ways? And maybe I'll begin with Ali with this one. Given USAID's emphasis on governance, I mean, this is, I think, where a lot of the resources are invested to really help strengthen institutions and plans and policies.
Yeah, and I'm just cognizant that we don't have that much time left, so I'll keep it a little bit short. But yeah, as you say, I mean, and we've been talking about governance this whole time as we've been discussing planning and as we've been discussing nature-based solutions. These are all governance challenges and approaches to improving the governance of what is, at least part of the time, a shared public resource. So, you know, I don't think we haven't been discussing that already. But I mean, some of the entry points that we've used traditionally for improving governance have been focused on technical assistance and improving the capacity and the performance of basin institutions, and you know, on down to water user associations. And you know, that work needs to continue, and I think we need to focus it more on some of the things that maybe we haven't focused on in the past, things like budget execution and you know, business practices, things like that can really be essential. I mean, we know that there's a huge financing gap in the water sector generally, but also for water resources management specifically. And I think, you know, some of the basic work on improving the business sort of practices and performance of those institutions on that level can be really, really impactful. And you know, also we can see with that adding in some new technologies can also be helpful. I think maybe Annette, you can speak to this in more detail, but in some of our work through SWP in the Mara Basin, and then also extending to other basins within Tanzania through USAID's Waridi activity, we've been working with basin authorities to improve their abstraction surveys with in conjunction with MWater, that they have an open source software and, you know, tablet-based platform that allows water managers to sort of more easily aggregate data from abstraction surveys and understand whether people are paying the required fees for that. And you know, that's step one, is to be able to collect the financing that is available already through just better management of things like abstraction surveys. And then, you know, on the horizon then is actually spending that money so that it's not taken by other for other uses outside the sector sometimes. So I guess I'll stop there, but I just want to emphasize that some of these fundamentals can go a long way towards solving some of the big, seemingly overwhelming challenges that we see with governance and financing in the sector.
Thanks, Ali. Annette, do you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I could add just a few words, just building on the work that MWater did in the Mara. You know, from me as a long-time planning professional, I was really excited about you know, how simple the software is, that you can just put it on a cell phone and have the ability to collect data. And what was really apparent in that is something I've found very often in my career. People will say, we can't deliver water to poor people because they can't afford it. And the truth of the matter is the poor people pay the most for water. This is a real misconception. And so even the money that was collected from that permit process, if it could have stayed in supporting the infrastructure in those communities, it could have a really big impact. And I was just struck once again through that work, the opportunity is there, the finance is there, the value of water is much more significant, I think, than we appreciate. It's a matter, I think, of education and capacity building. So building the capacity of water professionals in many of these countries to be able to do these kind of robust decision processes, know how to engage stakeholders, and be given the training to be able to do better planning and the financing that needs to go with that. It's a combination of I think political will and support. I think USAID is doing fantastic support work, but more needs to happen in this. So I'd really like to put a plug in for capacity building as an important next step in this.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I guess we'll end with, yep, go ahead.
Can I just add one more small plug for another resource that we have coming out that really focuses on this. And it's, again, the audiences are USAID missions and implementing partners. We're about to release a technical brief on improving water resources management. And it really, it takes a very high level view, but it really does focus on water management as a governance issue and talks a little bit more about some of these entry points. So I encourage you all to look for that on Global Waters sometime in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Ali. The final question, and I'm going to weave together a few threads that I think is a sort of a common point here. So we received a question, and this was following some of Jenna's comments about the work they were doing about pricing and resilience into cost-benefit calculations. There's a question around dealing with sort of multi-sectoral conflicts, sort of competing sources of demand across different sectors. And I think broadly speaking, one of the, we haven't really discussed groundwater, and groundwater is a really critical resource for many communities, but is also not well understood. And I think for the first two sets of questions, one thing that I think really stands out as being sort of central to being able to answer them is this question of data. And in many places, there just isn't enough data, or the data that we have is not useful for, projecting out and planning into the future. And so, thinking about current opportunities and tools, how are we addressing this question of lack of data, and then the type of data and information that we need for better planning processes and stakeholder engagement. I'm curious as how those are coming up in your work and how you're beginning to respond to them. Floor is open.
I have a phone ringing in the background. Someone else can take the first crack.
Okay. Maybe Annette, if you want to jump in.
I can. I mean, it's such a big question, right? I mean, on the other hand, I think increasingly with remote sensing, I think with the spread of tools like MWater, that the possibility of much better information is ahead of us. We're better at doing short-term forecasts, which can support irrigation, agricultural planning. I think the opportunity to get past this data hurdle lies in front of us. And something I would be excited to see is more transparency around the water-related data, to sort of get over the fact that I do a lot of transboundary work, so one country doesn't want another country to see their data, but these are sort of false. I think we have to get past that narrative. There's quite a bit of data out there. And I think it would also be useful, I was thinking as MWater collects data on abstraction, what if everybody could know how much water everybody else is using? Like to reflect that back so that we're not hiding from it anymore. I think water is increasingly a constraint. It's shared by all of us, and we need to think about it, as you had mentioned, Ali, this idea of shared visions. We really, it's a precious resource, and we need to think about how we share it going forward.
Thank you, Annette. Ali?
Yeah, I just want to quickly emphasize some of those points again. I think, yeah, in the profiles, that's one of the things that came out to me the most strongly, and I think it's not something that's new information, but yeah, just the lack of information and monitoring we're doing on groundwater resources in particular. So, I agree with Annette that there are tools on the horizon, and there is a lot of data out there that we just don't compile and share and utilize very efficiently. But we need to invest in those systems. And I guess I just thought I'd offer one or two examples from USAID for those of you out there in the audience who are looking for some case studies. Our Kenya Rapid program in Kenya is working with a social enterprise called Sweet Sense. And they're working with MWater actually to kind of connect low cost sensors on groundwater boreholes with remote sensing and a simple platform so that you can kind of monitor in real time both whether the pumps are working because the water is flowing and the groundwater level. So you get a sense of in real time whether or not the groundwater is falling, is adequate to supply communities with water during drought, etc. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to show that those types of technology fixes that relate to remote sensing especially can be sustainable and taken up. But I think that type of thing where we're able to take data that may have existed sort of in a scattered way, but make it more easy to kind of compile and look at in real time. I think they offer some promising solutions to this, and similar efforts underway that USAID is supporting in some of the transboundary basins in Southern Africa. Again, just working to compile the data that exists and put it into a platform that it's easy for countries to kind of have a shared set of information, and then also, using from that, developing some shared principles on how to improve the monitoring network. So I just offer that as, I really think that this data, especially with groundwater, it's critical, especially with climate change, because we know that groundwater is this potential source of resilience for us when surface water is becoming more vulnerable or variable, but we need to be able to manage it more effectively. So I think that's a really critical opportunity for us as development practitioners in the water space to make a difference with climate resilience.
Thank you, Ali. Jenna, is there anything you would like to add from your work?
No, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to participate today and learn from you all and get to know a bit more about these new resources, which I think will be helpful for us as well.
Yeah, for me, I've been so deep into these profiles for a year, and in some ways you feel very arrested by the challenges that are ahead of us. And in many of the countries and the places where we work and have connections to, and even, I mean, here in the United States and in Europe, I mean, we're seeing these challenges more and more, and just the cost and effort it's going to take to really respond to them in meaningful ways and in sustainable ways. I mean, we have big challenges ahead of us, but I think the three of you highlighted some really interesting examples and approaches in ways that I think are generating a lot of buzz and excitement and sort of low cost solutions, and the way that sort of mobile phones have really sort of radically transformed our ability to get information and to be able to engage with people in ways that can allow us to democratize these the participation of management and information gathering and analysis. So there's definitely a lot of work ahead, but I think there's I think really sort of promising opportunities for us to be able to address them. So with that, I would like to thank the three of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to participate and share your thoughts on these questions. I echo what Jenna said. I learned a lot. I think it was a very vibrant, interesting conversation. As a reminder for everybody, the profiles, the first 6 are up on SWP's page, and they will be going up on a rolling basis here in the next few weeks, and you will find them permanently on Global Waters SWP's microsite here in the coming weeks as well. And all of SWP's case studies. So we have actually a case study that we prepared with SCI on robust decision making. So the way it was piloted in the Mara Basin and in Cambodia in our pilot activities. And we're actually collaborating with Jenna and a few others on a white paper around source water protection for improved wash. So be on the lookout for that. And then, as Nicolas noted, his introductory remarks, his welcome remarks, that we'll be having a closeout webinar. Sadly, SWP is ending soon, and so we'll be doing something in early August to reflect on the lessons and the work that we've done over the past 5 years. I know there might be other questions that we did not address in the Q&A, so we will certainly take a look at those, and feel free to continue the conversation. We'll be able to continue the conversation offline, and I'm sure we will encounter each other in these future conversations and opportunities, hopefully in person sooner than later. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.